Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Meet the CEO. I'm Tim Rowan, and I'm pleased today to introduce you to a longtime friend of mine, Roger Shindell, who is the founder and CEO of Carosh Compliance Solutions. He's a nationally recognized HIPAA expert, and from the preliminary conversations I've had with him, I'm quite certain that he is going to have some very important information for you today. But before I let Roger jump in, I have to tell you that we're not only longtime friends, but years ago, we were in business together with a venture that has since transformed from what we were originally going to do into Roger's HIPAA training enterprise. And so we've struggled at the time to come up with a name for the company, and finally decided that the three partners, we would take the first two letters of each of our names. So when you wonder where in the world did the name Carosh come from, well, the RO in the middle, that's me. So, and the SH at the end. So, Roger, welcome to Meet the CEO.
Well, thank you, Tim. Good to see you again. It's been a while since we've seen each other in person with COVID, but hopefully that'll happen soon. I need to come out to Denver, so thank you for having me.
Well, this series is designed to educate my readers of my newsletter about important technology that is available to them. And I have interviewed a number of CEOs who talked to me about their view of the state of the industry, where we've come from and where we're going. So what I'd like to do is get you to talk about that exact question from the HIPAA perspective. What is going on? You know, sometimes it seems to me like HIPAA security and privacy is taking the kind of the same path that our response to COVID is taking. We're tired of it. We don't want to hear about it anymore. And people tend to get a little bit lax. So can you give us just a little bit of background on how serious is security and privacy today in healthcare?
Sure. Well, let me start out just by talking about some of the regulatory changes that have occurred and are occurring, and then we'll kind of go into where the state of the compliance is today, if that's okay for you. So
can I get you to speak up just a little bit? And yes, that's exactly the direction I want you to take the conversation.
Okay. So the biggest thing that has happened in the HIPAA world, there are actually two things. One, there has been some temporary relaxation on some of the uses and disclosure rules to accommodate what's happened during COVID-19 and what happens in emergencies, so that the regulatory agencies have basically relaxed their rules on disclosures to facilitate the disclosure of information in a timely manner when there's an emergency, or again under the COVID pandemic. The other big thing that has occurred is there has been a new regulation called the 21st Century Cures Act. There was recognized a problem in getting information released from providers to patients. And so the Cures Act was meant to cure this. That's, I guess, what we might call the bad news, because it put additional regulations on the agencies. The good news is that virtually all of it revolves around changes that are technical in nature, that are embedded in electronic healthcare record systems. So while agencies need to understand that the Cures Act is passed, it actually goes into effect this October, what they need to be sure of is that their EHR vendors have in fact implemented the requirements of the Cures Act into their software. The other big thing that's occurring. Go ahead.
The Cures Act has been around for a while, but you're talking about a 2022 modification of it?
Well, as with most regulations, the regulations are passed and then they have a period of time to begin implementing it. So while it was passed quite a while ago, implementation is by this October.
How's that going to impact your typical home health agency?
Only to the extent that they need to make sure that their vendors of software that they're using have implemented the requirements of the 21st Century Cures Act into their software.
So now would be a good time for them to start asking that question of their vendor.
Absolutely. Because one of the things that people don't recognize, typically a software vendor is classified in the industry as what's called a business associate. That is someone who collects, stores, or transmits protected health information on behalf of the covered entity, which in this case is the agency. And if the business associate is not complying with all the regulations around HIPAA, the regulations actually stipulate that if the business associate won't cure that violation, the covered entity, the agency, needs to terminate the relationship with the business associate. So what the agencies need to do now is vet their vendors for their compliance under the 21st Century Cures Act, because if they're not complying with the requirements and they won't cure that lack of compliance, the agencies, to stay compliant under the regulations, need to go look for a new vendor.
Oh, which is a major problem and disruption and a huge expense as well.
Absolutely, but from the business associates' perspective, the HR vendors' perspective, for them to stay in business, they need to make these changes. It's just that the onus of making sure those changes have actually occurred is going to fall to the agencies.
So when an agency is large enough to have the capacity to bring on a person or even hire an outside consultant to monitor their compliance with HIPAA and to harden their perimeter to protect against breaches, that compliance officer usually works in tandem with the EHR vendor, I'm sure. But how often does that happen? Is a perimeter breach, is a hacker, is that the major problem that we need to watch out for to protect patient information?
Well, absolutely. Cybercrime, which is kind of the rubric we put hackers under, is a continually growing problem, growing at a rate of about 65% annual growth rate per year. But there are two things you need to understand about hackers. About 20% of all the hackers that occur, and let me give an example of why this is important. If you remember a few years back, there was a large hack called WannaCry, which was locked up computers worldwide. And that hack, I think there are over 2 million machines that were locked up from WannaCry malware, which is a hack. But it only affected machines, this is 2 years ago, that were running Windows XP. Right? Windows XP has been retired for a number of years, so there are no security updates. So most of the hacks that occur are because people are not updating their software, in this case, the operating system from Windows XP, say Windows 10 or 7 or whatever. So the first part of the cybercrime comes around from that. The second piece is what we call social engineering, which are typically incursions of malware from spear phishing attacks and phishing attacks and people clicking on malicious links on the internet. We all call that all social engineering. And that's actually about 80% of all the cybercrime that's successful comes from a successful social engineering attack. And while you can implement specific technologies to help alleviate that, the number one thing you need to do is additional training specific on cybercrime. So for example, with our clients, while we do some cybercrime training as part of the standard HIPAA training, we also provide opportunities for additional cybercrime training using things like one of the big vendors is a company called KnowBe4. We actually are a reseller of that. But you want to make sure that you're training your employees, because across the board, the vast majority of breaches are people and processes and not technology kinds of issues.
That's actually less comforting than you might think to my readers. You're saying that 80% of the breaches occur through social engineering, which means that some employee has made a mistake somewhere, either opening a bogus email or even, heaven forbid, downloading a game of some sort onto a work computer, or being fooled by a phone call that pretends to come from internal sources and doesn't. And only 20% comes from actual attacks, hardware attacks on the perimeter.
And those are the most current statistics. And it's the reason why OCR, Office for Civil Rights, has published, and this goes back a little bit now, but it's still valid, published a paper that essentially said that their belief is the root cause for virtually every breach is inadequate training, because people are not doing the kind of training required under the regulations to keep the PHI, protected health information, private, safe, and secure.
We did have an instance like that in home care a few years ago that that was caused by that 80%, by they believe anyway, an employee that clicked on a email they shouldn't have clicked on. And it was during that time that I got to know that you mentioned the company we sell called KnowBe4. I interviewed them and wrote about them because they were a big help with this home health and hospice software vendor that suffered the ransomware attack. Their customers were shut down for weeks, and it was a serious problem. But yes, we do have one major example. I know that you work with hospitals and physician clinics and dentists, but you also work in the post-acute arena, and that is the one instance that I can think of, at least, that was publicly admitted, when an employee made a mistake and it caused a massive problem for thousands of people.
Well, interestingly enough, if you're interested in seeing what the real-time statistics are, you can go out to HHS, Human Health Services website. If you go Google something called Wall of Shame, although they've renamed it, every breach that has 500 or more records that has been published goes out on that website. You can scroll down, you can filter by home care, by hospice, by dentists, by physician practices, and see what's out there. The reality is, again, the latest statistics are that you as an agency, you as a covered entity, is going to have one breach. 96% of you will have one breach every 24 months, and almost 50% will have 5 or more breaches in that 2-year period. What we tend to find is people are not recognizing security and privacy incidents nor breaches until they get educated about them. And then all of a sudden, we're hearing from our clients literally on a monthly basis about, this occurred, is it a breach, do I need to report it? So in our view, breaches and incidents are occurring, people aren't recognizing them, and that's a major, major problem, because you're most likely going to be contacted by the regulatory agencies, either because you self-report a breach, or in about almost a third of the cases, because someone files a complaint against you because your information has been breached and you haven't reported it. And that is not the position you want to be in, because that doesn't make you look good in the face of the regulatory agencies. And just as one final note on this topic, compliance, the regulatory agencies understand that breaches are going to occur. And what they're looking for is best effort to make sure breaches don't occur and rapid remediation of a breach when it does occur. So if you have to wait for someone to file a complaint against you for a breach, it puts you on the wrong side of what OCR, Office for Civil Rights, is looking for. So we, in our practice, have had to file, I'd say in the past 5 years, maybe 4 dozen breaches with OCR. We have yet to have a client who's paid a fine or penalty because of a breach, because they're able to document that they were doing everything they needed to do to keep that breach from occurring. But again, and not to go off in a different direction, fines and penalties are not the largest concern you should have around having a breach.
Look, this brings up a couple of important questions. You mentioned that the HHS website, and I'm going to ask you to repeat that in a second to make sure everybody's got it. The HHS website lists breaches of 500 or more healthcare clients that have been impacted. How do they get that information? Do they find it themselves? What is the requirement with that 500 threshold?
Well, first of all, anytime you have a breach that's reportable, your obligation requirement under the regulations is to report it to HHS. And they have a portal that you can go ahead and report it. About a third of all those breaches they investigate, they are notified through a complaint. So any patient who has a complaint about an agency regarding privacy and security can also go out to the portal and report a breach, or there's an 800 number they can call to report a breach, and that way OCR finds out about it. Now, on their wall of shame, and that's exactly what you want to Google, is HHS wall of shame, and it'll bring you to the link where all these are reported. Only reports those breaches that they know about that are 500 or more records. But additionally, under the regulations, if you have a breach that includes 500 or more records, you need to notify your local media outlets of the breach. So the breach will be reported in the newspaper, it may be reported on the radio, on the internet, on TV, and of course in today's world of social media, that is going to expand.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is extremely important. You have to tell the media about a breach that you have been responsible for through your fault or your employee's fault or something. What is going to happen to your reputation, especially if you are a healthcare provider that relies on referrals from other healthcare providers?
Well, that's a good question, Tim, and let me give you a little bit of a long answer so people just understand what's going on. Because you as an agency rely on referrals, when you have a breach, you are going to find that you have reputational harm. About 38%, almost 40% of the actual total cost of a breach will come from that reputational harm and what we call patient churn. Patients that leave your practice or leave your agency, patients you never see because you don't get referrals. So the actual total cost of your practice, and this will be a little wonky for a moment, is not just the fines and penalties. Fines and penalties only amount to about 15% of the total cost of your practice. So as an example, the median size fine and penalty today is about $50,000. That means the total cost of your practice is going to exceed $330,000 for a single breach. And remember, you're likely to have one every 24 months and 5 or more, half of you'll have in 24 months. So that $330,000 could actually be, much closer to 5 times that. So 38% of the total cost of the breach is gonna be from the reputational harm, from lost revenue. So that $50,000 fine turns into $330,000 total cost, turns into $126,000 of lost revenue. So that by far is going to be a bigger issue for you as hospitals and physicians stop referring patients to your practice or your agency because you have had a breach. And I know that agencies are under enormous financial pressure. So you have to ask yourself, what is an additional $126,000 of lost revenue in every 24 months going to do to your agency? And it's certainly
exactly. That is pretty severe. So what is required to have the documentation that you were doing due diligence, that you did everything you could to prevent a breach? You mentioned that your clients have not paid any fines. So what kind of training are you talking about? How do you step in and help people to do a risk assessment?
Right. So don't want to get too commercial here, but I would recommend people go out. We hold a weekly webinar where we go through all the details of this and how you can keep yourself from having the problems of having a breach. Our website is carosh.com. You can sign up for the weekly webinar to get an in-depth version of what happens. But to give you a vast overview, there are 5 components of what we call the cycle of compliance. So first, you need to do a security and privacy risk assessment, which looks at all 103 vulnerabilities that are in the regulations and assesses what your risk is of having both of those vulnerabilities come to pass and what the impact on you and your patients would be if those vulnerabilities come to pass, i.e. you have a breach. Once you've done your risk assessment and assessed all those vulnerabilities, you need to generate what's called a remediation plan, which is a map of how you're going to remediate all those vulnerabilities. So, for example, the regulatory agencies recognize you can't remediate all vulnerabilities at once. They want to see you conduct what they call meaningful progress through that remediation. So the remediation plan is a roadmap with time benchmarks as to how you're going to remediate these vulnerabilities. Those need to be done on a periodic basis, typically once a year, and whenever you have a security incident or privacy incident, or you have a way your operations change. The next thing you need to do is, one little known requirement of the regulation is you need to be able to document that. Well, first thing you do as part of the remediation is customize policies, procedures, and safeguards. And we find many organizations don't have all the policies and procedures that are required. Another small pitch, you can go out to our website on the resources page and download templates for all the policies and procedures you would need. Those policies and procedures need to be customized and updated. Again, periodically need to be reviewed whenever you have a security incident or privacy incident to understand what happened, why the policy didn't keep the incident from occurring. And again, whenever you change your way you operate or your IT infrastructure. Next thing you need to do is you need to conduct training. You want to create what the regulatory agencies call a culture of compliance, which means that periodically you want to do short trainings as opposed to one long training. These trainings actually need to be on your own specific policies and procedures to pass regulatory scrutiny. And then the last thing you need to do is you need to do an audit of your program. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're actually operating the way you say you are with your policies, procedures, and safeguards. And this needs to be done on an ongoing basis. I know it's a lot of work. There are ways to get it done, but those are essentially the things you need to do to make sure that you are completing, again, what we call the circle of compliance, those 5 different steps.
A lot of people I know have tried to do their own risk assessment, and it is not always passed muster with the regulatory agencies. I'll give you one more plug. Tell us how you accomplish the risk assessment in your 2-day workshop?
So we have developed a piece of software we call HIPAA Suite. If you're familiar with TurboTax or TaxCut, it is analogous to that, but for HIPAA. And one of the modules, the very first module, is doing the risk assessments, generating the remediation plans. So we do a 2-day workshop called HIPAA Express, where we get up in front of the room, have HIPAA Suite on the screen. You have your own version of HIPAA Suite on your laptop, or if you're doing it from your office, which you can attend from your office, you do on your desktop. And we walk through step by step all the different items, all the different questions you need to ask to build up that risk score. So we actually, in the 2-day workshop, don't tell you how to do a compliance program, including the risk assessment. We actually walk you through it. So at the end of the 2 days, you actually have a fully compliant program in place, which we actually guarantee. We will actually indemnify you for the first $100,000 of fines and penalties if you have a breach, if you have done the workshop and you maintain your compliance, which we help you with. Again, if you go to our webinar, we go through all these details. I don't want to belabor people with that now, but the way to get the risk assessment done so it will pass regulatory scrutiny and be guaranteed that it will would be to sign up for this HIPAA Express, which is really a unique event in the industry. We know of no one else will actually let you walk away with a completely compliant program. And to give one plug, if you don't mind, Tim, all for the course of $1,450.
So I'm going to put a link to, you mentioned weekly webinars, brief ones that explain all of this. I'm going to put a link to one of your recent ones at the end of this for people to use, but I also want to put a link to your website so that they can do more research and so that they can get to know you. So you said Carosh.com, CAROSH.com is the way they find you. I'll put that and your email and phone number at the end of this session, as well as the link to that webinar. How often do you do these 2-day sessions?
We typically do, right now we're doing one a month in person around the country, so in different locations, but we also live stream them so that someone can do it from their desk. We also have a virtual version we do. So as opposed to 2-day workshop, someone who's really stressed for time, we have a virtual version where on 3 consecutive Wednesdays, we do a 3-hour session. So we break what's really 18 hours worth of work down to 9 hours. We can do that because we limit the number of people who can attend those. So the number of questions we get are smaller, and we don't take the same kind of breaks. So essentially you can find at least twice a month where you can attend the HIPAA Express, and we're actually adding more and more dates every month as we get more and more people interested in going to these. So there is a bit of work you need to do after the workshop, but we explain that during the workshop.
To recap, just because we're almost out of time, there are changes coming to the HIPAA regulations that EHR vendors need to be on top of. There are huge fines if you have a breach, and most breaches are caused by employee slip-ups. So therefore, training is your best defense against these fines. But the fine is minimal compared to the hit to your reputation if you start to lose referrals. So training, risk assessment, and ongoing training is the summary of your message.
Yeah, if I could add one other point, we didn't have time to get into it, but there are a variety of other changes occurring in privacy and security around healthcare that the agencies need to understand. There are more and more federal and state regulations coming down the pike that augment what you have to do around HIPAA. That's the bad. So one more thing, we didn't have time to get into it, is there are a variety of changes to privacy and security regulations around healthcare records that are going to specifically be an issue for the agencies. So for example, OCR has been very aggressive going after organizations that are not providing information to their patients on a timely basis. In fact, the last 27 reported breaches, each costing $65,000, were around that specific item. But more importantly, both at the federal level and the state level, more and more privacy and security regulations are being enacted. There are now 4 states, California, Virginia, and Colorado, Virginia, California, and Utah, who have implemented something similar to GDPR, General Data Protection Requirements, out of the EU. That is also being looked at the federal level. And additionally, in the last year, 19 other states have implemented more rigorous privacy and security regulations. If the state regulations are more rigorous than HIPAA, those regulations trump the federal regulations at HIPAA. So beyond the 21st Century Cures Act, there's more and more that agencies need to be aware of. That's the bad news. The good news is that a robust HIPAA compliance program will accommodate all these new changes. So you can really hit, multiple birds with one stone, so to speak, by having a good, robust HIPAA compliance program in place.
And it's likely that more states will implement those kinds of laws as well.
Correct, and also at the federal level, yes.
At the federal level as well. So protecting yourself, training your people, it could save you thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. But the important thing is per breach, right?
Correct. And the other thing we should also note is just like the whole history of a home care agency follows its license, so will HIPAA breaches.
Oh, so that hit to your reputation, it stays with you forever. It's like a police record.
Correct.
Well, I wish that you had been able to come to us today with good news, but this is important news. And if people are intent on keeping their business thriving, dealing with all of the current issues, whether they are regulatory or competition or the perennial problem of recruiting and retention, keeping people trained, keeping people aware that it is still an issue, even though HIPAA as privacy and security regulations have been around for a long time, and people sometimes don't take them as seriously as they used to. This could have a significant difference in the survival and the success of your home health agency.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything you said. I would say there is good news, though, which is if you work with someone to get your compliance in place and you maintain your compliance, all the negative things that can occur essentially will go away. So,
and that's probably one of the most important points to leave with, isn't it, Roger? That if you are showing progress, if you're showing good faith efforts, it's likely that you will be able to avoid at least all or part of the fines, even if you do have a breach.
that is true. In fact, yesterday we got a final resolution letter from OCR for one of our clients who had a 1,000 record breach, and they walked away without any fines or penalties. And so that is not only possible, it is likely. And the reason for that is there are so many organizations that are not in compliance that OCR would rather spend their time, looking at bad actors as opposed to organizations that are trying to do the right thing.
So if you're not making that good faith effort, if you haven't done the risk assessment, if you're not doing the training, then you're going to be attracting their attention.
Absolutely. And one other point, I mean, I know this is really deep into the weeds, but when you're being investigated by a regulatory agency, you need to be able to provide up to 6 years worth of all the information on risk assessment, remediation plans, policies and procedures, training. So you want to make sure that as part of your program, you're working with someone who has the ability to assist you with that. And there are a lot of people out there who really don't know what they're doing. We're essentially, for a regulated industry, the providers of these services are completely unregulated. So you want to make sure, if you're working with someone, if you're getting training, if you're trying to have your internal people get trained up to work with you internally, that you are getting good, accurate information. Buyer beware.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if a larger organization in home health hospice was able to afford a full-time person with your level of expertise, they would understand all these things and they would have ongoing training programs. But your program sounds like it would be cost-effective and time-effective for all of those providers that are not large enough to have the wherewithal to have a full-time in-house person.
Well, that's true. I would agree with that. I would point out that if you have someone who's trained up to the level that we and my people are, you would end up having to pay them somewhere in excess of $180,000 a year, because they could walk into literally any hospital in the United States and get employed for that amount of money for something that you only need on a part-time basis. So we think it's a good idea to get someone internal who manages your HIPAA training. HIPAA program has some training because it helps you acquire employees and retain them, because there's a professional path they can go on, but it is going to be enormously difficult to maintain someone who has the level of expertise that you really need to have in-house on a full-time basis, unless you're exceedingly large, because 180 grand is a difficult number to absorb for something you only need on a part-time basis.
Exactly, for all but the largest hospital systems. And as a comparison to that 180,000, tell us again what your 2-day workshop charges.
Sure, our 2-day workshop is $1,450, and if you decide to maintain our HIPAA suite when you leave the workshop, which we think is a good idea, of course, and we discount that for workshop attendees. But the total package of workshop plus HIPAA suite is $3,200.
Okay. Well, that now is all the time we have. So I want to thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
And I appreciate the time and the opportunity.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us. Now, Roger Shindell is the founder and CEO of Carosh Compliance Solutions, and we will post at the end of this all the different ways that you can contact him for more information. And as always, you are welcome to contact me directly at editor@homecaretechreport.com. And I will hope to see you as a subscriber, if you're not already, to my newsletter, which is free. And you can find the subscription button at our homepage at homecaretechreport.com. So Roger, thanks again. Thank all of you for joining us. This has been Meet the CEO. I'm Tim Rowan. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.